Okay, great. Great hymn. If you would turn to 1 Kings chapter 18. As I was approaching, especially looking at the first half of this chapter, what jumped out at me was how Elijah is on offense, and I thought about how important offense is. Christianity, we always feel like we're kind of on the defense, and I'm just going to say, believe me, as a lifelong Cleveland Browns fan, having a good offense is really important because we haven't historically good defense. Sometimes you get the occasional pick six, but man, if you don't have a good offense, it's hard to win games. And I can't help but wonder, as we were going through these passages and thinking about the conflicts that Elijah was going through in his day, I sometimes worried that our own witness, that our own way of presenting the gospel, we're going to talk about this a little bit in the first hour of the next few weeks, the way that we think about the gospel and the lordship of God and the idea of discipleship, if these have become so watered down that they're just ignored by our culture today. We don't have much of an offense. Our message, our songs should have enough substance that they are turning heads and perking ears up and maybe even offending some people and causing some conflict. I'm not a big fan of conflict myself, and I don't sense that Elijah is as well in some regards, especially in the next some of the timidness and some of the insecurity he exhibits in the next few chapters. But I think we're going to find ourselves more and more in this culture in conflicts, not just over things we say or how we say them, but in terms of the substance of the gospel itself and the substance of our faith and of Christianity. Seeing Elijah's confidence during this clash at Carmel, I hope will give us some assurance, some hope as the world becomes increasingly hostile to the things of the Lord, as it seems to be doing so now. So, simple outline: Elijah on the offense, chapter 18, verses 1 through 19, and then Elijah in conflict there with as he's clashing with these prophets of Baal on the hill on the Mount of Carmel. So we're going to go very quickly through this chapter. I'm not going to read every single verse. I'll try to read a few passages or a few verses at a time, and we'll go back and talk through those. I suspect you're familiar with this, with most of this story, but we'll move through it fairly quickly. Elijah on the offense, and this is what really struck me. And I was, like I was saying, I was just going to kind of go through it, maybe kind of summarize through this first half of the chapter. But it really is interesting because it shows that Elijah is on offense. He's not waiting to be dragged before the king. He's not waiting for the army to catch up with him, and then he's going to be some. That'll happen later on, but he's on offense right now, and I think that was really interesting. As we think about the clashes we have today, how we're always so on the defense. What does it mean to have someone, one of God's people, really on the offense? And I think that's what we see. He's not offensive. He's not disrespectful. Not afraid. Confident and true to the Lord. And I think if we were to assume that a little bit more, I think in terms of our own stance, I think there's some good lessons for Christians today in an increasingly antagonistic world. So let me just read verses 1 through 5 of 1 Kings 18. And again, this is we're leading up to this dramatic conflict on Carmel. But there's some background here that we need to know. So verses 1 through 5 of 1 Kings 1 Kings 18. Now it happened after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year, saying, "Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the face of the earth." So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe. Now that's kind of the summary. Now we're going to get into the story of how that confrontation happened. Now the famine was severe in Samaria. Another background bit of information. Ahab called Obadiah, who was over his household. Another little background here. Now, Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, for when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and provided them with bread and water. Then Ahab said to Obadiah, "Go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the valleys. Perhaps we will find grass and keep the horses and the mules alive and not have to kill some of the cattle." So this is kind of an interesting background. We're leading up to this clash. At this point, I almost feel like Ahab has sort of given up he's not looking for Elijah anymore. He's looking for water. Just anywhere we can find water to feed the animals here. God says here that the drought after these 3.5 years, or 3 years, almost 3 years, is going to be over soon. And we're told that the famine was very severe, especially in Samaria. Remember, Samaria is the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel. Ahab calls Obadiah. He's a house servant. This is not Obadiah the prophet. This is a different individual named Obadiah. He's going to help him find water. Ahab seems, interestingly enough, more concerned about getting water to the animals than overseeing this people, which is kind of interesting. And then we're told this information that Obadiah is trying to keep kind of under wraps for the most part. Does not want Ahab and Jezebel to know that he is so sympathetic to the one true God, Yahweh of Israel. He has hidden 100 of his prophets in a cave or in two parts of a cave when Jezebel started killing the prophets. Okay, so he is hiding and sponsoring and protecting these people. He provided for them. He sustained them at what must have been great personal expense, not only materially, but also great personal expense to his career. What do you think is going to happen when Jezebel finds out about this? Not going to go well for Obadiah. So Obadiah was called by Ahab. He says, yeah, he's going to go find water. Okay, good. We're going to go find water. He's not going to kill me because of these prophets. He didn't find out. I'm going to fast forward a little bit if you allow, and I'll trust if you want to read some of the details a little bit more on your own. What they decide to do is Ahab is going to go one way, Obadiah is going to go the other way. They're going to try to find some water to water the animals. While Obadiah is out and looking for water, he runs into Elijah. Elijah tells him to go fetch the king. Now this is so fun. Kings aren't summoned. You don't summon the king. Hey, I want to meet the guy. You go get him, bring him here. That's not how. That's bad form, Elijah. You're not supposed to do this. But for Elijah, he's trying to say, listen, God is still in control here. God is calling the shots. And honestly, I think this shows Elijah in an offensive position. I'm playing offense here. We're going to have a clash of ideas, of gods, and we want to see who wins. And he's throwing down the gauntlet. He's starting this process of throwing down the gauntlet here. He's not dragged before the king. He's not summoned. He is the one who is summoning kings. Kings and presidents and CEOs, they might wield some power today. A lot of it is imaginary. The reality is we are people, servants, ambassadors of the true and living God. We have power in our proclamation, and we need to be mindful of that and leverage it, not in some kind of brutal way, but with honesty and with truth and with compassion. We need to wield the truth that we have. We carry an authority that no coronation and no election could possibly provide. Obadiah is going to tell him a little bit about the background here. He's going to reveal to Elijah how thoroughly Ahab had been searching for Elijah. Verse 10, and as the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent to search for you. And when they said he is not here, he made the kingdom or nation swear that they could not find you. Okay, so there's been an exhaustive search for Elijah. Now, keep that in mind because Ahab is going to be surprised when all of a sudden Elijah shows up. Not with an army, not with he could have just kept on going away and just kept on running. But all of a sudden Elijah shows up. This is going to kind of shock Ahab in light of this exhaustive search that he has been making for him. He reminds, Obadiah is going to remind Elijah that he himself had hidden some of these prophets of the Lord, of Yahweh. Verse 13, has it not been told to my master, to Elijah, that when I did what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord, that I hid 100 prophets of the Lord by 50s in a cave and provided them with bread and water. Obadiah doesn't want to be killed here. And I'll tell you what the situation is. Obadiah doesn't want to get on Elijah's bad side, but Obadiah also doesn't want to leave Elijah and go find Ahab and say, Elijah's over here, and when they get there, Elijah's not there. Elijah kind of is there, and then he's not there, and then he comes and he goes. He doesn't want to show up, and there's no Elijah, and Ahab is going to be very upset about this. So he's pleading with Elijah, saying, listen, look what I've done for the Lord, and you're kind of sentencing me to this death penalty, it seems like. He's done a lot for the Lord. By the way, I think it's interesting. I think it's going to be more and more interesting as we're fighting battles in overt ways and subtle ways. Keep in mind the kind of sacrifices that we might have to make in upcoming years in order to fight these battles. Again, this Obadiah guy, he is considerable resources, considerable threat to what he's doing in order to forward the things of Yahweh God, even under the nose of Jezebel and Ahab. And I've got to imagine he's pretty nervous about this, and he's nervous that Elijah is not going to be there when he comes back with Ahab. Uh, he tells uh, Elijah that he's hidden these 100 people. This is interesting because Elijah is going to conveniently forget that truth 3 times in the next few chapters. Elijah's going to say, "It's just me. I'm the only one." Well, you were just told that there's at least 100 guys that have been preserved. You're going to find out there's a lot more than that who have been preserved as well. But I think Elijah is going to, in his weakness and his insecurity, going to kind of throw this out as though he's the only last guy left. It sometimes feels like we're alone. That's the reality. It sometimes feels like we're alone in this spiritual battle. There's a lot of people fighting this spiritual battle. We might not see them right next to him as you would in a normal battle, but there's a lot of people fighting. You're not alone. Um, and Elijah assures Obadiah he would not leave while Obadiah gets Ahab. They go and get Ahab. In fact, he says in verse 14, "Go get your master. Say Elijah is here. And Elijah says, "As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today." So he's going to be okay. Again, Elijah is oddly in control of this situation. Ahab's got an army, Ahab's got chariots. This is just Elijah, and he does kind of look a little alone today. And yet, as he is ministering for the sake of the Lord, he doesn't look alone. He looks like he has all of the power, and he is certainly fighting this battle from an offensive position. Verse 16 then. Obadiah went to meet Ahab, told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. The gang's back together again. This is great. Not really a reunion like a Beatles or something like that, but it's nonetheless they're back together again. What Ahab says to Elijah in verse 17 is really interesting on a couple levels. First of all, he says, "Is this you?" Now remember, they were face to face about 3 years earlier. Elijah kind of stands out in the crowd. You're at a party. Oh, there's Elijah. I mean, the way he dresses, the way he acts, he stands out. But Ahab says, "Hey, is this you?" He hadn't seen him face to face in a while. But remember, he's also surprised because Ahab's been looking for him for 3 years. And you think by now you'd be so far out of Dodge, and all of a sudden you show up? That's weird. Why, and you're showing up and you're calling the shots here? So there's a moment in Empire Strikes Back that I think is really fun. And I'm sorry, I know that the Millennium Falcon is getting chased by one of these huge dreadnought ships. And they're not going to outrun this. They're not going to outgun this thing. So they decide he's got a kind of a plan to escape, but he's going to turn around and he's going to face the ship and he's going to start, and the ship is huge. It's 100 times bigger than him. And it's funny, you're listening to this, and one of the guys in the Imperial ship says, "What is he doing?" And the other one says, "They're moving into attack position." You're wondering, why is the Millennium Falcon moving into attack position? This guy is so shocked that he's doing that. That's exactly what Elijah is doing. He's saying, "Is this you? Are you serious? You're here? You're moving into attack position right now? You don't have any right. You don't have an army. You don't have anything. And you're moving into attack position." Elijah is shocked that he's standing there in enemy territory, knowing that he is a hunted man, yet he's summoning the king. He's calling the shots. He's about to call for a duel. He is definitely in attack position. Okay, and I think this is really interesting. Again, I think we're often caught off guard when we should know cultural things that are going to happen, and God's people should have a response to these kinds of things. We're always being chased by what we think is the big starship, when we should be moving into attack position, especially knowing that we do have superior weaponry. We do have superior tactics. We do have superior, as the passage that Dwayne read, we have superior weapons. We should be using them, I think, a little more faithfully. The Star Wars illustration is now over. For those of you that I lost, come on back. But for those of you that didn't, that really got it, you really appreciate that. I just thought that was funny. He's moving into attack position. Elijah's moving into attack position. I think we should too. And again, we're not calling for some kind of a physical war as much as for a greater offensive maneuvering and tactics. It always seems like we're reacting and not proactive. It always seems, by the way, like we're perpetual. I know I've talked about this a lot, but it seems like we're always so shocked by sin. I can't believe how bad the world's sin is. We've read Romans 3, okay? We've read Ephesians 2 about the people are dead in the trespass and sin, and yet we're shocked when the world acts sinfully. We're always responding to cultural trends away from God, but rarely creating cultural trends toward God, moving people to God with the proclamation of the gospel and the truth of God's word and the wisdom of God's word, trying to help them move toward meaning and purpose. And then the other thing that Ahab says to him in verse 17 is this you? He says, you troubler of Israel. Abraham's a smart guy. He's a politician. He knows that Elijah is on offense and that he's on defense, and he's trying to switch the script on him. He's trying to put him on the defensive. I got to imagine, too, Ahab calling Elijah the troubler of Israel. This must have felt great to Elijah. He's like, yeah, yeah. I've been called a lot of things in 20 some years of ministry, and some of them were painful. Some of them were badges of honor. They were like, yeah, thank you for calling me that. Interesting, too, Ahab sees that he's on that he is on the defensive, and he wants to be on the offensive. The world calls us all kinds of things. We're homophobic. We're anti-science. We're irrelevant. We're irrelevant. We are none of those things. This is part of the offensive strategy against us, to label us with these ridiculous things. We're not homophobic. We're not afraid we're going to get cooties or something like that. That's not what we are. We are about truth. And we do want to respond to these things with truth. We're not anti-science. In fact, I think the belief in God is one of the most scientific, it's very scientific. It accords well with what we observe in nature and in science. And I think we need to be on the offensive with some of those kinds of things. Elijah sees the ruse. He is not going to back down, and he's going to go back on the offensive in verse 18. I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord, and you have followed the Baals and Baal worship. He says, listen, this is not a me problem. This is not me. I'm not the problem. And it's not a one-person problem. This is a national problem. This is a problem with the house of Ahab. This is a problem that goes all the way to the top. You are the problem. They forsook the one true God. They forsook his commandments. For instance, an important one of 10, the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, verses 2 and 3. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. It was the first commandment of a series of pretty straightforward commandments. Not a lot of ambiguity there. And not only had Baal worship become part of Israel, it had become institutionalized by this king and his house and his family. This is not ambiguous. You can't forsake God as an unbeliever or a believer, as an individual or as a nation, and expect that there will be no consequences. Other things that are said in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 28:20, the Lord will send upon you curses, confusion, and rebuke in all you undertake to do until you are destroyed and until you perish quickly on account of your evil deeds, because you have forsaken me. The magisterial collection of Isaiah's sermons that are encapsulated in the book of Isaiah. We're 4 verses in, Isaiah 1:4, and he says this, alas, sinful nation, people weighed down with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly. They have abandoned the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They have turned away from him. Now, I know you say, hey, that's not us. That's not our church. That's not me. Well, that might be, but I want to move as far away from that as possible. If there's anything in my life where I'm forsaking the Lord, where I'm not honoring the Lord, where I'm not attributing to him lordship in my life, I want to move as far away from these condemnations or these descriptions as possible. I want to avoid anything in which I am forsaking the Lord. But Elijah says to Ahab, you have forsaken the Lord, your house, the nation, has forsaken the Lord. Ahab wants to blame Elijah. Elijah doesn't fall for the trap. The blame belongs to the nation, to a ruling household, to a king who has turned away from God. And he challenges Ahab to a duel in verse 19. Now, then send and gather me all Israel at Mount Carmel, together with 400 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. Okay, we're going to have a standoff. Hundreds to one, but Elijah has no doubt who's going to win. The Lord's going to win, and Elijah, the Lord's man, is going to win. I wonder, shouldn't we be making some more preemptive strikes too? Again, I'm not talking about, doing something violent or physical. I just mean preemptive strikes. I think there's a few things we should be doing in terms of preemptive strikes. First of all, we should be sharing the gospel. We do not have a better tool, a better weapon than the gospel. We talked about it the first hour this morning on the back of your, there's brochures on the back. It has information about our church. It has the gospel, sin, substitution in Christ. That he died in our place, rose from the dead so that we can have eternal life. We can appropriate eternal life and forgiveness merely through faith, just believing it's that easy. And then once we do that, we'll want to pursue Christ by following him. Following is not necessary for salvation. It is the expected outpouring of salvation. Very simple. It's a powerful message. That should be our main offensive weapon. I think, prayer, of course. And we're going to see Elijah's simple but sincere prayer in the next passage. I think we have to be careful about this notion in culture that we shouldn't be saying spiritual things or shouldn't be talking about spiritual things or leave the spiritual stuff at church. I thought this was interesting, and maybe you saw little clips of this. Russell Brand on Bill Maher's show about a week and a half ago, and he goes off on this rant. By the way, if you know Russell Brand, he's talking and he looks crazy, but you're like, I think I'm agreeing with a lot of what he's saying. That's the problem. What does that make me? He's really very articulate. But at one point, what he did is he's very, very sarcastic and very mocky. That's kind of how he gets the point across. He says, he says, I know that we're in your great country of America, and I hate to say something spiritual. And then he said something, and I thought, well, that's interesting. What a funny jab. This great free country, and I hate to say something spiritual. And I'm thinking, when did it seem to become off limits to say something spiritual in this great country of unprecedented freedoms? What group of lawmakers said, okay, keep your spiritual stuff, keep it in church, keep it at home, keep it in your private devotions. We don't want that out here on the airwaves, in the discourse, in the public discourse. But oh boy. But to me, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is what committee of evangelicals says, yeah, we don't want to say too many things that offend the world, so let's just abide by their rules. Let's not talk about spiritual things. Maybe take them out for coffee, maybe with a neighbor or something like that. They don't want to hear about spiritual things, so we shouldn't push it too hard. We should be really careful. I think evangelicalism is being so careful in what it says that it's not saying anything. In a country where we should be on the offense with the gospel, with the wisdom of God's word. And we have to be very careful with that. I don't have time for this digression either, but I will say this, but I will proceed with it anyway. One of the first things I ever taught, and I don't know why, I was a teenager, I don't have a clue, but I was weirdly drawn to Matthew 16, verse 18. And of course, this is a verse, and it's, I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. And I kept thinking about that verse as I'm going through this passage and thinking about how Elijah is on the offense. Obviously, Matthew 16:18 is fraught with a lot of controversy. The Catholics will say, God is building his church on Peter and on the papacy. We as Protestants have a different view. We believe that there's some wordplay, and Jesus is saying, you're Peter, but on this Petros, this rock of the truth of the gospel, I'll build my church. And then we talk about, Hades isn't going to be overpowering us, these kinds of things. But I think we missed something really important. In fact, I never really heard anybody, and I asked some pastors about this. They're like, there's something kind of really important about that verse that I think we're missing. Jesus says, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Now, you know enough about the Bible and about ancient warfare. People aren't running around carrying gates in the open field, hitting each other with the gates or something like that. If you're battling the gates of your enemy, you are storming the castle. You are waging such a powerful offense-oriented war that you have surrounded them. You are laying siege to the enemy, and they don't have any hope. You're right there on the doorstep, bringing the battle right to them. A radically offense-oriented war. Why then does it feel like we're always surrounded by the bad guys, that we're the ones under siege? Elijah is not one to be under siege. He is not one. He is taken to the king and saying, we're gonna do this. We're gonna do this battle. Elijah in conflict, verses 20 through the end of the chapter. The showdown is going to take place in a very visible location where many people will be able to gather and see on the slope of Mount Carmel. Verse 20. So Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. With this opportunity that Elijah has to address all these people, probably mainly rulers of the nation, but others as well, he asked them to make a decision. He says in verse 21, Elijah came near to all the people and said, how long will you hesitate between two options? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But the people did not answer and say to him a word. The word that is used here for hesitate, by the way, is a word that is used for limping or wavering. Oh, the reality is people are just doing this for political reasons. They're not passionate about Baal, most of them. They just, hey, the Baal people are in charge. Let's go with that now for political protection. This is a cowardice. This is compromising on a high level. And just like we see in the New Testament, you can't serve Mammon and Christ. You can't serve Yahweh and Baal. You have to choose Christ or the world. And I think that has to be true in our proclamation, in our worship. It's got to be so full of distinctively Christian content that the world is seeing it. I think it has to talk about the blood, the cross of Christ, sin, hell. We've got to be talking in our preaching and our worship enough to both maybe certainly to offend unbelievers, but maybe to make even some moderate believers a little uncomfortable. The content should disrupt and offend, not the style or the manner. I put it this way, if it's too bland to bother, if our worship or our preaching is too bland to bother anyone, then it's not good worship and it's not good preaching. Notice how the people respond, by the way, in silence. Wow, that's quite a choice there that you've given us. They didn't know that there was a choice. They're going to serve Yahweh when it's convenient. They're going to serve Baal when it's convenient. They didn't realize, apparently, that they had to make a choice. Despite what Obadiah said earlier, Elijah claims he's the only prophet of the Lord. Again, verse 22, then Elijah said to the people, I alone am left, a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Okay, so those 450 individuals are there. Now, I'm not sure about this, but I thought this is interesting. He's pointing to the 450 prophets of Baal. He said, there's me over here, there's 450 prophets of Baal over there. Who are we missing? Go up to verse 19. He says to Ahab, bring all your 400 prophets of Baal and 450 prophets of Baal, 400 prophets of Asherah. It seems like in this conflict, the 400 prophets of Baal showed up. 450 prophets of Baal showed up, but where's the 400 prophets of Asherah? I don't think they're there. Why is that? Well, this is, in ancient worship, they were very gendered, okay? So Ahab is probably overseeing the prophets of Baal, Jezebel probably overseeing the prophets or prophetesses, most of them, of the female deity Asherah. And Ahab says, hey, you got to send these 400 prophets and prophetesses and priestesses. Jezebel says, no, I don't think that's a good idea because they're going to die. is I think what she's thinking. She doesn't want to sacrifice her 400 prophets of Asherah, but go ahead and send your 450 prophets of Baal. She knows they won't do well, and maybe she knew that Baal and Asherah were a lie. Keep in mind that back then religion was used mainly to manipulate people and to affirm your authority over them. And I think Jezebel knows that if she sends her 400 prophets of Asherah, they are not going to do well. And they're not there. But we do have these 450 men. Again, I'm going to streamline through the story just a little bit. I think you know the basics. Both sides prepare an ox on an altar. that altar is prepared by, everything's ready except one thing, fire. I'm not lighting them on fire yet, okay? Going to prepare everything. They each get a bull, an ox to do that with. And then the prophets of Baal, Elijah lets the prophets of Baal go first. By the way, he's still in control of this thing. He's still on the offensive, which is interesting. He says, you guys go first. Okay, good. They're going to go first. They start early in the morning. They cry out to Baal to answer them for probably about 4 hours from morning until noon. Verse 26. They took out the ox which was given to them. They prepared it, called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." There was no voice, and no one answered. Keep that in mind, because we're going to see that again in just a few minutes. They leapt about the altar which they had made. Elijah Elijah gets snarky. This is fun. I love these verses. These are great. Verse 27. It came about at noon. He's just going to sit there. He's not going to make fun. He's just going to sit there 4 hours ish. It came about at noon that Elijah mocked them. Call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he is occupied or gone aside or on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and he needs to be awakened. He's making fun of them. Baal is traveling. He's busy. He's napping. Some argue that Elijah is suggesting that Baal is in the celestial restroom. Hey, maybe, the wording, and our translations are going to try to be as classy as they can, but some suggest that the mocking, the wording is that he's indisposed, as we would say. By the way, if any of these things are true, he is already a lesser deity to Yahweh God. Yahweh does not sleep. He does not travel. He does not get distracted. Psalm 121:4 says, "Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep." And you know what made me think this week? We should be kind and compassionate. But sarcasm is funny. Russell Brand was funny. And some of the ideas that we face today are simply laughable. Like we talked about last week, they used to be on different spectrums of the same reality. Now I'm not even sure you're in touch with reality. We're going to defund the police stations and the police departments in our major urban areas. That should fix everything. What a great idea. You try that. I'll be somewhere else where they pay their officers very well. That's a laughable idea. And yet, these things get a lot of attention. False worship and many worldly ideas are just dumb and worthy of mockery. They kept yelling. They cut themselves. The blood flows. Look at what he says in verse 28. They cried with a loud voice. They cut themselves according to their customs with swords and lances. By the way, that's interesting. With swords and lances, not with knives and daggers. With a long sword, with a lance. The blood uselessly, futilely pours out of these deceived men. They cry out. They continue to. I'm sorry, I lost my place here. They continue to cry out until evening. Maybe they've been doing this for 10 hours. If they start at 8 in the morning, they go to 6 in the evening, and there's no answer. Look what he says in verse 29. When midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. And look what the text says. But there was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. Amazing, the mutinous of the gods of this world. Jeremiah 10:5 says, like a scarecrow in a melon patch, their idols cannot speak. They must be carried about because they cannot walk. Do not fear them. They cannot harm. They can do no harm, and they can do no good. And yet our age worships idols that can, some of which are more innocuous and harmless, none of which can do any good. False worship and the many worldly ideas are vacuous and provide no real answers. Okay, we've had enough of this. It's Elijah's turn, right? And this is kind of the fun part here. We're getting up to about verse 30 here. And Elijah said to all the people, "Come near me." Now, by the way, everyone here is tired. They're cranky. They're expecting a great show. This would be terrific. What a tremendous disappointment Baal has been. What a profound letdown. this has been for them. They're cranky. They're probably a little disgusted by all the blood that they have seen. Elijah calls the people to his side. He repairs the altar that was broken in verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near me." So all the people came near him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. The altar had been broken. It was in disrepair, like the nation's worship. It was in profound disrepair. He put 12 stones on this altar, according to the number of tribes in verse 31. Interesting, even at this moment, he's making a fascinating political statement about the unity of the people of God. Even during the divided kingdom, he takes stones, each representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and puts them onto one altar, a reminder of how important unity is among God's people. And as we're talking about spiritual battles, I would just say it is very hard to fight the world and the devil when the church itself is in such disarray and disunity. Isn't that true? He cuts the ox, he lays it on the wood and on the altar, and he says he does. Interesting what he says, by the way, verses 32 and 33. So with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 measures of seed, and he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. Interesting how it says in verse 32, so with the stones he built the altar in the name of the Lord. In fact, Colossians 3:7 says, "Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through him to our God and Father." And maybe that's part of the problem. We are not doing everything we should be doing for the name of the Lord, for the glory of the Lord. He is so confident in God that he wants his demonstration of God's power to be foolproof and fraud-proof. Look at verses 33 to 35. I'm sorry, just look at 34 and 30. 33 to 35. Then he arranged the wood and cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering on the wood." Now remember how precious and valuable water is right now. This seems like a big waste of water, except for what Elijah is trying to do, to fraud-proof the demonstration of God's power. And he said, "Do it a second time. 4 pitchers of water, pour it on this thing." That's good. Cool. Awesome. Do it a third time. This will be very hard by any trickery to kind of light this thing on fire. Oh my goodness, look at what the Lord did. He basically has fraud-proofed this thing. It says in verse 35, water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench it also filled the trench with water. He is so confident in God. They pour 4 pitchers of precious water on the altar 3 times, a sign of thoroughness, a sign that if God is going to do something, it is going to have to be something amazing and something evident and distinctive. And then I love his prayer in verses 36 and 37. At the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again." What a tremendous prayer. This is a reminder that prayer is critical in our spiritual battle. Dwayne read earlier Ephesians 6:18. "With all prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit, and with this in view, be on the alert with all perseverance and petition for all the saints." And then notice what he says. I underlined this in my Bible in verse 37. Answer me so that I would look cool. Or answer me so that more people come to my church. He says, answer me so that more people will know you, that you are Lord, that you are in charge, that you are the only God, that you are unopposed by any other way of thinking or any other false deities. He wants people to know God. And by the way, that should be our passion for our evangelism and discipleship today. That more people are supportive missionaries, that more people will come to know, to hear, to love, and to follow Christ. That should be our ambition. Notice all of the screaming, the self-mutilation that Elijah does. No, he didn't do anything. He just stands there. He prays. That's all he does. There's no jumping around, dancing, anything. No self-mutilation. No waiting, by the way. Verse 36, then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. There's not a single person that saw that firsthand that will ever forget that moment when Yahweh God showed himself definitively as the victor over all opponents forever. Fire comes shooting down, as definitive and dramatic as can be. God does respond to prayer, especially in conflict. Maybe not always this definitive or dramatic, but he is working and he does respond. The people in verse 39, perhaps for the first time ever, they fall down to worship and confess that the Lord is God. They fell on their face. They said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. Not Baal, not anyone else, but the Lord. And these things suddenly look very bad for the prophets of Baal. Remember the 450 guys that are sitting there, they're bleeding, they're trying to patch up their wounds. Like, oh man, this is going to be something. This is all of a sudden looking very bad for them. They have now been exposed for the frauds they are. And I think to a certain extent, we have to use biblical truth on the offense to point out how fraudulent a lot of the ways of the world's thinking really is. Because it is. Elijah commands them, the prophets of Baal, to be seized. He oversees the execution of them by the brook at Kishon. And you say, well, that might be kind of brutal. Well, you saw what they did to themselves. They didn't apparently think very highly of themselves. I like what Swindoll says. The prophets of Baal were an immoral, hostile, and anti-God malignancy in the land of Israel. Elijah knew that he had to cut away all evidence of such a godless menace. And Elijah wins the day. Now, what happens after this, we'll get into next week. There's some insecurity, there's some struggle that Elijah has to go through. Maybe one of his biggest battles is against himself and his own feelings about what had just happened. But I think it's important to say that as important as this clash at Carmel was, there was a far greater showdown several centuries later on a hill outside Jerusalem at Golgotha. Every spiritual battle, large and small, corporate and individual, was fought at this dramatic battle when Christ died on the cross of Calvary and then rose from the dead 3 days later. That's the battle. That's the victory that we have. We're not talking about just a future victory. We're talking about a victory that has already happened, and we can live in that victory. He defeated death, and he evidenced that death by an empty tomb. I'm going to go about 3 or 4 minutes over, if you will allow me. I'm going to turn to Colossians chapter 2, kind of a way of thinking about Jesus' battle over death and his enemies. Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. I would want to read the whole chapter, but I'm just going to restrict myself to these verses. Colossians chapter 2, verses 13 through 15. It says, when you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and yet has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. And I love verse 15. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. Christ has brought definitive victory, and we need to live in that victory. In conclusion, a few things to remind you of. Remember that our conflicts might not be as dramatic as what happened here in Elijah on Mount Carmel, but we should still move into cultural and interpersonal conflict armed with the gospel, armed with biblical truth, armed with confidence in God, and with an unwavering commitment to God and to his word. We're not about picking fights. We can't just go out and pick fights. But we do need to fight. And again, Ephesians 6, 10 and 11. Be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. Arm yourself. Bible study, apologetics. You have a concise gospel presentation that you can go through in 2 minutes. That you can do that easily and share the gospel, the true gospel with someone. And we also have to be in prayer. We have to be in prayer for our missionaries, for our culture, for our outreach as a church, for evangelism and discipleship, for the advance of God's kingdom and the advance of his glory. It's good that we do okay on defense with our apologetics and all that stuff. But I think we have to think about what our offense looks like and maybe bolster our offense a little bit more. And maybe we as individuals and we as a church need to do that as well. And I hope you will take that seriously with studying, with growing, and with prayer. Good. I'll ask Sadhu to come and we will close our service.